Dear friends, many elderly individuals worry about growing old without anyone to care for them, often feeling lonely during times of illness. They fear being without their children or grandchildren to talk to, which leads them to decide to move in with their kids. However, when they receive advice not to live with their children in their later years, they often think that there are all kinds of children, some are caring and some are not. As a result, the elderly typically choose to live with the most devoted child in the family. But did you know that once you reach your 60s, no matter how caring your child is, it's best not to live with them? Staying for a few days might be enjoyable, but living there long-term can lead to various problems. In today's video, we invite you to listen to the following story to understand the reasons behind this. The story I'm about to share is a story of Mrs. Melia, who was enjoying her retirement until one day when her children asked her to move in with them. Without hesitation, she agreed, and what began as occasional visits to care for her grandchildren quickly turned into a constant responsibility. Suddenly, she found herself changing diapers and preparing bottles. Her days, once filled with social activities and time for herself, were now completely consumed by the needs of her children and grandchildren. But Mrs. Melia didn't complain. Like many mothers, she felt it was her duty to help her family. However, fatigue began to accumulate, along with an unexplainable sense of loss. Imagine being on an emotional roller coaster. On one hand, you love your grandchildren dearly and cherish every moment with them. But on the other hand, you feel like your life is slipping away while you change yet another diaper. It's like trying to hug a cactus, beautiful but painful. Studies show that this syndrome can have devastating effects on grandmothers' mental health. The lack of recognition, physical exhaustion, and loss of personal freedom can lead to depression and anxiety. It feels like running an endless marathon with no one waiting for you at the finish line with a medal. Mrs. Melia began to experience these symptoms. She felt increasingly tired, but told herself that it was normal, just part of being a grandmother. But is it really normal to sacrifice your well-being for the sake of others? The answer is no. Many middle-aged women are living this reality, sacrificing their time and energy without realizing that their happiness is also fading away. As the days went by, Mrs. Melia found herself looking out the window more and more, longing for her former independence. She remembered the days when she could go out for coffee with friends without asking for permission or juggling schedules. Now those outings seemed like an unattainable luxury. Ironically, she had moved closer to her children, seeking companionship and closeness, but now she felt more alone than ever. As writer Paul Tho once said, "Loneliness begins with family." Perhaps he was right. The story of Mrs. Melia takes an unexpected turn. What began as a dream of family togetherness has turned into a silent nightmare. Have you ever wondered how a decision made from love can lead us down a path we never imagined? The words from her child felt like a bucket of cold water poured over her. This incident was not isolated. Gradually, suggestions morphed into commands, and advice turned into reproaches. Mrs. Melia sensed her space shrinking, her voice fading away. Psychologist Erik Erikson warns us about the importance of maintaining autonomy in old age, as losing independence can lead to an identity crisis and feelings of hopelessness. Mrs. Melia began to feel the weight of this reality. Her days, once filled with projects and dreams, were now reduced to caring for her grandchildren and following orders. Where was the woman who had planned to travel and learn new skills? Those dreams faded into the shadows of others' expectations. Frustration grew in Mrs. Melia's heart every time she heard phrases like, "You should do it this way," or "Why don't you do it like I said?" Those words, felt like small splinters in her self-esteem, and resentment, a most unwelcome guest, began to settle into the home that once offered her refuge. One night, after a particularly tough day, Mrs. Melia found herself silently crying in her room. She felt trapped, worthless, like an old piece of furniture that nobody appreciated but no one dared to throw away. In seeking the warmth of family, she had lost the fire of her own identity. Closeness, which should have been a blessing, had become an invisible cage. And the key that broke the ice was the unexpected visit from Mrs. Melia's dear friend. Her friend was genuinely surprised and asked, "Melia, is that you? You seem different." She noticed the dark circles under her friend's eyes and the tired expression on her face. That was the moment when all the pent-up emotions burst forth like a river overflowing its banks. Mrs. Melia began to confess everything: her exhaustion, her frustration, and the feeling of being trapped in a life she no longer recognized as her own. "You know, sometimes I feel like I've lost my essence. I'm no longer Melia, I'm just grandmum," she admitted tearfully. "I love my grandchildren, but where is the woman who dreamed of traveling and read novels until dawn?" Her friend seemed to empathize with Mrs. Melia, as she had gone through similar feelings and had found a solution that changed her life. Her friend recounted, "Do you remember when my kids convinced me to move in with them? Well, after 6 months, I realized I was making the biggest mistake of my life. She had lost her independence, her hobbies, and her essence. But one day," she continued, "I remembered the words of philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson: 'The only person you are destined to become is the person you decide to be.' And I decided to be myself again." "It wasn't easy," she admitted. "My kids didn't understand at first, but you know what? Over time, our relationship improved. They no longer saw me as a burden or a constant babysitter, but as their mother, an independent and happy woman." Mrs. Melia then asked, "Do you ever feel lonely?" Her friend smiled and said, "Of course sometimes. But loneliness doesn't come from not having people around. It comes from the inability to communicate the things that seem important to oneself. My conversations with my children and grandchildren have become much richer and more meaningful. True happiness comes from living independently while maintaining a healthy balance between family responsibilities and taking care of yourself." Did you know that recent studies have shown that older adults who maintain their independence have better mental and physical health? In fact, older adults who live independently report higher levels of life satisfaction and lower instances of depression. They even have stronger immune systems. Your children will love you more when they see you happy being yourself. Start with small steps. Take that painting class you've always wanted to, or go for a walk. Life is long if you know how to use it, she pondered, wondering if she was truly living her life or just existing. Mrs. Melia seemed to have unlocked a knot in her heart, and she was determined to change, starting with a simple act: taking a solitary walk in the park. At first, she felt guilty for not being at home helping out, but she soon realized that that hour of solitude was like an oasis in the desert. If you find yourself in a similar situation as Mrs. Melia, consider making a change. Maintaining independence in old age not only improves mental health, but can also increase life expectancy by up to 5 years. Mrs. Melia was living proof of this. With each new activity, with each personal decision, she felt rejuvenated. However, not everything was rosy. There were days when guilt washed over her. "Am I being selfish?" she asked herself. That was when she remembered the advice: you can't pour from an empty cup. Taking care of herself wasn't selfish. It was essential to continue caring for others. As Mrs. Melia regained her independence, she noticed surprising changes. Her energy increased, her chronic pain decreased, and her memory even improved. She was a vibrant woman with interesting stories to share. Finally, Mrs. Melia gathered the courage to have an important conversation with her daughter. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she also understood that it was necessary. As poet Maya Angelou once said, "There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you," and Mrs. Melia had a lot to share. Mrs. Melia shared, "Lately, I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I believe it's time for me to move into my own place." Her daughter looked surprised, questioning her reasoning. Mrs. Melia gently smiled and replied, "No, my dear. You all have been wonderful, but I need to rediscover myself and have my own space." While she enjoyed being around her children, she felt she would be a better grandmother if she had time for herself. Her daughter responded, "You're right, Mom. It's just that we're really going to miss you." A family psychologist pointed out that conversations like this, although difficult, are crucial for maintaining healthy relationships between parents and adult children. Open and honest communication can strengthen family bonds, even when it involves significant changes. The visits from her grandchildren became eagerly awaited adventures. They transformed from monotonous afternoons in front of the television into explorations filled with laughter and discovery. Mrs. Melia's independence created a ripple effect throughout the entire family. Her children admitted that seeing their mother independent and happy inspired them to reconnect with their own dreams. It turned out that freedom is contagious, and Mrs. Melia's example sowed the seeds of change in all her loved ones. The paradox of love that Mrs. Melia discovered is that sometimes we need to be apart to truly become closer. It seemed they had found the secret recipe for a happy family, and the main ingredient was a little distance. Mrs. Melia realized that the key was not to live with her children, but to create a balance in their family relationships, neither too close nor too distant. She figured out how to maintain a close bond with her family without sacrificing the freedom she had just regained. This new approach surprisingly enhanced the quality of the time she spent with her family. It was no longer endless hours of repetitive routines, but special moments filled with laughter and genuine connection. This new balance not only made her happier, but also healthier over time. Mrs. Rosa's story shows us how an act of self-love can transform not just one life, but an entire family. Dear viewers, it's clear that while Mrs. Melia's children were initially hesitant, this sparked a reflection on their own lives. They are learning a valuable lesson about the importance of independence and the necessity of never stopping their personal growth. Are we respecting the personal space of our loved ones, or are we unintentionally suffocating them with our expectations? Through this video, I encourage you to ask yourself, are you living your own life or the life others expect from you? Remember, it's never too late to start anew. Life is too short to live in fear. Step out of your comfort zone and do things that challenge you from time to time. The best gift you can give your family is your own happiness. I hope this video has provided you with valuable insights. If you have any thoughts or suggestions, please share them in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more content like this in the future.